you want me to look here? Or?
No, but just look at me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, reforming Islam is not going to be easy, and anything that is worth it is never easy. This is a very big conversation. So when people say it can't be reformed, I want to know, why do you think Islam can't be reformed? Is it because of Muslims? Is it because of the hadith? Is it because of the Quran? So we can go down the list one by one and break apart every single reason and get down to the root cause of, well, why can't it be reformed? When we look at the faith, we look at something that is, this giant snowball. It was meant to be this one little snowflake, and over time, people added more things to it: history, interpretations, scholarship that was codified into law, and now we have this really big, complicated snowball. So when we look at the question of reform, we're trying to get back to the original little snowflake that was in there that started all of this. It's not easy, but it's possible. I think we look at the history. We look at where things like blasphemy laws came from. We look at where things like hadiths and sunnas came from. And why do they have so much importance right now? Because a lot of the problems that we have in Islam come from hadiths. They come from the sunnah. They come from the religious scholarship that was codified into law. And then they come from different historical events. Then we go down to the Quran. We have two different sort of a split personality. We can say Islam is dynamic and it allows for interpretation, or we can say there's a really big problem with the doctrine of jihad. So then we can start looking at the real problem, where I think it comes down to not even Muhammad as a prophet, because he's just a man, end of the day. So we look at this book that we believe is infallible, and then let's break that down. And to do that, we have to look at back to Muhammad, who ultimately received this message. And I think that when we do that, we humanize the problem, and we take it away from this realm of this divine theology, and we look at it through scholars and through rationalists and as intellectuals. And through that process, you come closer and closer to the possibility that reform is possible. But first you have to sort of pluck it from the heavens and put it down among men on earth. And through that, I think it's possible.
Yeah. And what I like...
Well, I'm a humanities major, and that's what I studied, and then I went to law school. So I look at a book as a book. It's a book. And God himself didn't write it. It was given through, the spirit of the message was given through a messenger and through revelations. So that's sort of the problem there. We have the spirit of the message, what we thought Islam was supposed to be, and then we have the messenger, and the messenger is human. So I feel like once we recognize that there's a division between divine ordinance and the spirit of the message versus mankind and humanity and the frailty that is mankind, we can understand that there's a problem there. There's a lot of things that Muhammad did that were a problem. Okay, so the question of whether the Quran is infallible, I feel that it's not a question of whether it's infallible. Well, let's look at what the Quran is. The Quran is a book, and the book is based on the message. So let's push back on whether the Quran is infallible and look at the message. What was the message? Who did it come to? And when we, as human beings, understand God and understand the nature of God, and then we look at some of the messages in the Quran, we as rational people, as humane people, understand that there's sort of a schism between what we know is right and wrong, what we know is moral, and what the Quran dictates. And I think so, when we question whether the Quran is fallible, let's get rid of the idea that this is a book that we can't touch, and let's explore it. Let's explore it like we would any book that we sit down with and we read and we think for ourselves, because I think more important than the question of whether the Quran is infallible is what divine gifts do we have as human beings. We have the gift of intellect, we have the gift of reason and passion, and let's use this to figure out what messages make sense and what messages don't. And it's not a matter of just getting rid of the messages that don't make sense or changing the Quran. It's a question of understanding what the message maybe was supposed to be versus what it became. It's a really great question when we ask, is the Quran a book and the message based on the historical context and the time period of Islamic Arabia, or is it something that's timeless? And I think the answer is both. We can understand that a lot of what happened and transpired in that region, it was a tribal period. There aren't a lot of resources, so there's a lot of infighting and warring. At the same time, when you have a message from God, it is supposed to be timeless and error-proof. So for me individually, and I don't speak for any other person, but for me, when I see a message that's meant to be from God and it has a flaw, that doesn't represent God, because God is omniscient, and he, she, whatever you want to call it. This intelligence is timeless, and so that message is supposed to be timeless as well. So when you root it to a historical context, even questions like, people say, well, slavery, Islam didn't so much allow slavery, but it allowed for the transition out of slavery. Not good enough, because the God of all things wouldn't allow people to own other people. So maybe there's a militancy in that message from where I see it. I see it as right is right, wrong is wrong. Divine law is divine law. You don't compromise on those values, and you wouldn't compromise on certain values today. Doesn't matter whether it's a historical context or a cultural context. Certain things are right, certain things are wrong, and when it's coming from God, it has to be 100% right. And if it's not right, that's where we see the crack in the message.
Yeah. So you don't see any contradictions between secular laws and democracy and Western values, or if you want to call them universal values as well. You see a contradiction between those kind of ideas and values and critical thinking and enlightenment, and then Islamic reform?
Again, yes and no. So there is a lot of great things about Islam that lend to humanist values. At the same time, Western democratic principles are still, in a lot of ways, in their infancy. When we look at things like abortion, the death penalty, these are things that we still look at things on the basis of man's law versus divine law. And so the sort of Western legal system is still struggling in bridging that gap between what many of us feel is divinely ordained ordinances versus what is liberal. If we look at the issue of abortion, for example, and not to derail so much, we can, of course, force every woman to have a child that she doesn't want to have, but we can inspire her to recognize that this is a life. So this is sort of a challenge that even the West is dealing with in its own system at this point.
Yeah. But when you say divine law, is that like Sharia law then?
Sharia is man-made. So when we look at Sharia, a lot of what we see as Sharia law is stuff a bunch of old men sitting around thinking about, and it's not to belittle the scholarship at the time, because the scholarship that existed in medieval Islam was really fulfilling, and I wish we had that level of dialogue today, and we don't. I think we're fighting to that level of dialogue. But the problem was a lot of the conversations that occurred back then, they became indoctrinated and codified into the theology. So when you have Sharia law, you have what a lot of people interpreted as being part of Islam, and it really wasn't part of Islam.
So you don't. So your kind of Islam is an Islam without the law system, the ideology of what I see as, and I call it the mainstream Islam. Mainstream Islam ideology.
And the laws.
Yes.
Thank you.
The question of whether, what sort of law should we follow in Islam. Islam was meant to be a very simple faith. Do right, don't do wrong. And then this is where the question of reform comes into play. It's complicated because a lot of what Islam became and the derailment after the first 12 years was through sort of a system of militarization. And the question then becomes, well, if Islam was meant to survive, it had to become militant, it had to become militarized, it had to become what we call today as radical. So if we want to deconstruct Islam and come back to something simpler, we have to really look at it through that historical lens and realize that, okay, this is the point where it really derailed, and that was through the actions of the Prophet. I completely contest that was something that was divinely ordained. I feel like it would have been better that Islam had stayed simple, its laws had stayed simple, its ethics had stayed simple, rather than become the start of this sort of complicated beast that was necessary in order for it to survive. So it was better for Islam to have died off simply versus become this sort of abomination that's become today. Because when you talked about whether, how Muslims in different sects takfir each other, and how they see other Muslims as not being real Muslims. And when we talk about mainstream Islam, well, what is mainstream Islam? Mainstream Islam is just what's popular today. But again, when you come back to the core message of what any faith has, the core message of Zoroastrianism, the core message of Christianity, the core message in Judaism, we look at the Kabbalah, Buddhism, Hinduism, these core messages are so simple. And when you now have a faith that's become so monopolized through Islamism, it's become so radicalized through politics, and it's become this sort of abomination of itself, then you have to challenge it, and you challenge it by looking at the theology of it.
So you're actually dividing the Medina versus Mecca time in Islam's first years.
That's
Is that what I'm
right?
just trying to
Looking at Mecca and Medina is really key, because it's not a matter of just saying that Islam was peaceful and it became violent. The question is, why did it become violent? And ultimately, it needed to become violent if it were to survive. And then that's the question of, well, was that Muhammad's move, or was that God telling Muhammad? Was that, like, for example, if you start a nonprofit tomorrow and it's doing really great, but unless you sell out to this corporate donor, this nonprofit's going to die, most people would make the move to ensure that their business survives. Religion, in a lot of ways, was a business. And so in order to make sure something survives, this tribe survives, you take the necessary moves. And I feel like that's really where it became really radicalized and extremely deviated from God's message.
Yeah.
You asked that question because when you talk about my version of Islam, I don't feel that it's my version of Islam. And when we talk about what's fringe versus what's mainstream, it's not about, I don't think it's about that. It's not about me or my version. It's about the truth. And so hundreds of years ago, we had people, we had a person who thought the earth was round. And everybody else thought the earth was flat. And so thinking that the earth was round was a personal philosophy. It was a fringe idea. It wasn't popular. But it doesn't matter because it was the truth. And ultimately, the truth catches on. I don't think you can hide it. Yeah. And I think right now we're at a point where things are so chaotic. And I really observe people. I love people. And I love watching how people think and how they change their mindsets and how their pattern of thought changes. And people are changing. People are paying attention. The level of chaos we have right now in the world is forcing people to pay attention and start thinking about things. And it doesn't mean that you walk away from this conversation and change your mind, but it's a slow drip pattern over time where people start realizing, something's not right, and that leads them to a path that is truthful. So it's not about the reform movement, it's not about my version of Islam, it's not about a fringe movement, it's about the truth, and ultimately the truth always wins out. And I feel more frustration with Muslims in the West who are privileged and who are comfortable and who say, that's not really my problem. It is your problem. You don't get to say you're Muslim and not be a part of the solution when it's at our doorstep at this point. And if it's in our faith, it's at our doorstep. It doesn't need to be literally at our doorstep. When I look at Muslims in the other parts of the world that are oppressed, they want to speak out. They can't speak out. I mean, look at the guy, the journalist student who was killed for quote-unquote blasphemy. And so Muslims in the West have a responsibility. There's so much that I can say right now here with you, and I'm comfortable and I'm safe. And our brothers and sisters in other parts of the world don't have that freedom, so it's our responsibility. And the thing that I find really fascinating is that, for example, the journalism student that was lynched and then shot, that news hit social media and Western Muslims before, technically, it hit most of Muslims in Pakistan. And I find that really fascinating that there's sort of a slower awareness, but because of the sort of level of chaos, and because of the dialectic of enlightenment, which looks at the pendulum. And I feel like when we hit the pendulum to the point where there's so much chaos, you get to a point where you can't ignore things anymore. So even in the midst of all the war and the sort of failed Arab Spring and the regression of liberalism in the Middle Eastern states, there is an opportunity there. And I feel like
I think the reason why we don't see reform in Muslim countries, or we don't see criticism of mainstream Islam and the ideology of Islam or the politics of Islam, is because that people are afraid. Do you think that the same thing is going to happen in the Western countries with the terrorism on rise?
In terms of people being afraid to say anything?
Yeah.
I don't think so. I think the nature of society here is so different. One of the reasons I personally feel, and I'm not an expert by any means, but from what I see, one of the reasons why we don't see more reform in places like Pakistan, for example, is because it's not just a theological problem, it's a political problem. So these are really...
And a cultural
problems as well. So these are really entrenched problems where in order to impact and prevent a student from being lynched, you can't just change the religion. You have to infiltrate the political system, and that's really hard in a place like Pakistan. And there's a lot of people in that part of the world who, when you're rich and you don't have to worry about where your meal's going to come from, where your safety's going to come from, you live in a bubble. And so you have these people in that part of the world who are living in two different worlds, even though they're in the same country. You've got these rich elites who have completely different lifestyles, and nothing that impacts people on the ground really impacts them. So there's no motivation or incentive, and I feel like that's a failure of humanity. It's a failure of conscience. But when it comes to the West, if anything like that happens where we're afraid to speak out, it's going to be through things like the blasphemy law, which was just passed in Canada. We have more city-states in America. There's an article I'm writing about which has at least 4 different major cities, LA, New York, San Francisco, Philly, and I think those are the 4 major ones, where they're passing motions, statewide ordinances, to ban people from criticizing Islam. What does that even mean?
Really?
Yes. So that's how it starts, where, for example, fast forward that trajectory for another 5 years, someone like me might get sued for speaking out, for writing anything, and so that becomes a legal problem. And when you bog someone down with the legalities, and you limit the freedom of speech through things like blasphemy laws, and calling it Islamophobia or calling it racism, and you're using those sort of liberal values to push your agenda, I think that's how it's going to impact us here in the West, unless we continue to fight this fight.
Yeah. And I saw you debate. I think she was Pakistani.
Saba Ahmed?
Yeah. And she's a conservative Republican?
Yes.
Like a member of the Republican Party?
I believe she's a member of the Republican Party.
Yeah.
Right.
And what do you think? Because the same thing happens in Denmark. Like a lot of political parties and the leadership in those parties, and even like Obama would have Muslim Brotherhood affiliated people within his circle, or what do you think about that? Do you think that the Western leadership, of like the politicians in Western countries, when are they going to understand that there is reformers, and then there is Muslim Brotherhood, and then there is ISIS, and Brotherhood is not a better solution for Muslims and for politics in the Western countries than, say, ISIS?
Well, someone like Obama, when he affiliated with or associated with Muslim Brotherhood figures or alleged Muslim Brotherhood figures, he doesn't even see that as a problem. He doesn't see the affiliation, or he doesn't think it's a problem. So there's sort of this like La La Land fantasy world where, there's only 2 types of Muslims, the extremist and the good Muslim, and they don't see exactly what you just mentioned. They don't see that the shades of gray in between. Right now, it's a completely different landscape because we've got Trump in office.
Yeah.
And
what do you feel about that? Because Faisal, for instance, and some of his colleagues from who he works with, they're very much anti-Trump, and I'm not that negative. I was happy when he won because I would not have Hillary win the election. I was thrilled because I don't live in the U.S., but in the last days of election I got to know about Huma Abedin.
Yes.
And I was like, what the hell is going on? Why aren't we talking about this? And then I read about Keith Ellison and Dalia Mojahed and other people, and I was like, what is going on?
Yeah, it's a very complicated scene right now with the Trump administration. I don't even think they're at a point where they can really talk to Muslims like myself, because they're still trying to figure out their own house. They're trying to figure out their own masthead. So you're dealing with a businessman who became president, and he's dealing now with a political system and the sort of the intrigue that that creates. And I think it's going to be a while before we see him work with reformers in the way that we probably would like to see him work with reformers.
Obama didn't, right?
Obama didn't even acknowledge that people like us existed. So that was a huge problem. with Trump, Dennis Prager said it best, where he said that choosing between Trump and Hillary was like choosing between a door that said man-eating lion and then a door that said maybe man-eating lion, and you're gonna go with the maybe. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So you took a chance
because
with Trump.
nobody knew him. Nobody knew him politically.
Exactly. But there is a chance in hell. And so let's put Trump aside, good, bad, whatever, doesn't matter. But the controversy that Trump created, even
being the first Western leader who said Islamic terrorism has got to do with Islam. That is major in my book, because then you're actually talking about the problem. Everybody else was trying not to talk about the problem.
You cracked open the sort of Pandora's box where everything came out, and now you can talk about things in a way that you couldn't talk about things ever before. So even if Trump ends up being a complete failure, to me it doesn't matter, because we don't have Hillary in office, so that's a huge win. And secondly, we have so many more opportunities to have conversations and dialogue, and there's a much softer environment now because mainstream media is under a huge microscope. They're being challenged, and so it lends to an opportunity that just didn't exist before.
Yeah, and what I think is very interesting is that when I see Zudi and I see Asra Nomani and Rahil Reza, I think, all of these people, they're actually not like Trumpsters,
right?
But they're kind of they understand where he's coming from, and they kind of support him. I mean, Asra Nomani voted for him. Zudi didn't, but he actually defends a lot of what he's doing when being in office. And the ban, what do you think about the ban?
The travel ban, well, to go back to the reformers, Asra voted for him because of the healthcare issue, not because of the Muslim issue. Zudi had his own philosophies, and I respect that. We agreed
you were also voted.
I was pretty much the only reformer that came out in support of Trump at the time of the primaries. So for me, it's, wasn't an easy choice because, gosh, there's a lot of backlash. But at the same time, I don't like games. I like people who are honest and truthful, or at least say it like it is. And that's what I value. And so when I see someone who has been right time and time again, even though his statements are outrageous at first, when you sort of, percolate them and you filter them out, there's some truth to what he's saying. And he's always been right about Ghazala Khan, for example. So when you look at what Trump is, he's someone who has a potential to be a game changer because he's a chaos agent in a way. Now, that is different than where we're at right now with the administration. There's a couple of complications. I'd like to see, more conservatives in the administration and less family, but we'll see where that ends up being. The question of the travel ban.
Yeah.
So even when we talk about the travel ban, it's actually not a travel ban. It's a temporary restriction on selective states that were already red flagged. And to say that
by Obama.
Right, exactly. But to say that, we have this hyper-focus on this quote-unquote travel ban, but this is just one thin onion layer of this entire onion, and we have to work on peeling all these layers away in order to deal with this. Designating the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization is another one. Looking at Islam and radicalism as a philosophical problem is another one. Working with reformers, activating other reformers who are in those sidelines, who haven't been comfortable enough to come out, is another one. So there's so many things that need to be done. My frustration with quote-unquote the travel ban is, it needs to be, these sort of measures need to be rolled out more smoothly. In order to do that, there has to be a lot more hiring within the administration to bring on the sort of quote-unquote sausage makers who can push out policy, who can do a lot of the work that really the administration came in at a deficit for some. There's a whole different story, but they need to be able to fill out that administration fully, manpower it, and then they can do this.
Do you believe in the ideological vetting of immigration?
Absolutely, but that's a hard thing to do. How do you vet someone for their ideas? Daniel Pipes at the Middle East Forum had a great plan on how to do that, but ultimately it takes more than just the 2 years of back and forth paperwork, which is just paperwork. And someone can easily come forward and present the best version of themselves in some rehearsed answers. What it takes, in my personal experience, having been an immigrant, having been a refugee, having been around immigrants my entire life, is it takes that conversation. So immigrant to immigrant, or a person from that culture to a person from that culture, having those conversations. Even social media vetting and looking at their past profiles and their past posts helps, but it doesn't really guarantee anything because those can be scrubbed. Exactly. So it takes real conversations, and there's going to be a lot that I figure out in a conversation with a potential immigrant. Those little nuances, the way they answer the question, the body language, there's things that I can pick up that somebody else will never be able to pick up because they aren't from that culture.